If I told you that one decision in Washington could push grocery prices across America higher overnight, while Canada watches calmly from the sidelines, would you think I was exaggerating? Because that is exactly what experts are now sounding the alarm about. Donald Trump has announced he is prepared to impose very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, a move that analysts say won't punish Canada first at all. The very first people to feel the hit will be ordinary American families standing in the supermarket aisle wondering why their food bill suddenly exploded.
Companies, it's not Canadian governments that are paying the tariffs that will be imposed on potash. It's American consumers, because farmers use potash as part of their fertilizers on every single acre of field producing food in the U.S.
That single statement sets the tone for the entire story ahead. Donald Trump is threatening tariffs on a product the United States cannot replace, cannot produce at scale, and cannot afford to lose. Yet it represents the very foundation of its own food system. 80% of all potash used by American farmers comes from one source, Canada. So why would any U.S. administration choose to weaponize something so essential, so structurally irreplaceable? And what happens when political theater collides with an economic dependency this deep? To understand why this threat is so explosive, we need to examine the political ground Trump is standing on. Analysts across the political spectrum agree he is entering one of the weakest phases of his public career. His national approval rating has slipped to 36%, an unprecedented low for a president at this stage. Recent off-cycle elections delivered more setbacks for Republican candidates, while poll after poll shows Americans frustrated with rising costs, and many voters link those costs directly to Trump's tariff-heavy economic agenda. Adding to the pressure, several of Trump's signature trade policies are now in jeopardy before the U.S. Supreme Court. Legal scholars warn that one decisive ruling against him could dismantle years of tariff frameworks in a single blow, exposing not only economic miscalculations but political vulnerability. In this environment, Trump is reaching once again for the tool that defined much of his presidency, tariffs. Not because they are sound economic strategy, analysts argue, but because they project strength at a moment when the numbers portray weakness. This is the backdrop against which Canada suddenly finds itself swept back into a trade confrontation it did not provoke and may not even have to respond to. Trump's warning was direct and unmistakable. If necessary, he will impose very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer. It sounds like another hardline trade moment, familiar and predictable, but fertilizer is not steel, it is not aluminum, it is not lumber. Fertilizer is the backbone of the American food supply, and this is why the threat is uniquely destabilizing. The United States has neither the reserves nor the processing infrastructure to replace Canadian potash. Any tariff would send immediate shockwaves through U.S. agriculture. Farmers' input costs would spike, crops would become more expensive to grow, and within weeks, Americans would see the consequences where it hurts most, on the shelves of their grocery stores.
I don't understand how when they get 80% of the potash that they use, 80% of the fertilizer they use, comes from raw materials from Saskatchewan, Corey's home province. It is so bizarre to me that they think they can invent a solution.
Analysts stress that this is not some distant hypothetical concern. It is a hard structural dependency. Trump's threat zeroes in on a commodity the U.S. cannot replace, cannot substitute, and cannot grow food without. That forces a blunt question into the center of the debate. Is this genuine economic policy or political theater with consequences that land squarely on American households? Economists across the spectrum rarely agree on anything, but here they do. These tariffs make no economic sense for the United States. The first group hit would be American farmers. Potash is not optional. It is the nutrient foundation for corn, soybeans, wheat, and nearly every staple crop feeding the country. With no domestic alternative to fall back on, farmers would have only one choice: pay more. And when farmers pay more, the entire food chain pays more. Grain prices climb, livestock feed becomes more expensive, and that ripple quickly reaches beef, poultry, dairy, and eggs. The math is brutally simple. Tariff fertilizer today, watch grocery prices rise within months. We've seen this pattern before. Trump's earlier tariff battles forced the government to spend $12 billion just to keep farmers afloat. Consumers may shrug at pricier steel or aluminum, but food inflation hits immediately and personally. People notice when the cost of milk, bread, and vegetables jumps. As one analyst remarked, food is not complicated. That is what makes the political risk enormous. Trump could be blamed for raising grocery bills in an economy already straining families. This is why experts call his fertilizer threat economically backward and politically reckless, because it harms Americans first and hardest. If the economic logic behind the proposal falls apart, the political incentives make Trump's motives clearer. Tariffs have always been one of his most effective messaging tools, a way to project toughness, nationalism, and a readiness to confront long-standing trade partners. For a portion of his base, especially those convinced the U.S. has been taken advantage of, this rhetoric still lands with force. But experts say the fertilizer threat has less to do with policy and far more to do with political survival. With approval ratings falling, legal challenges stacking up, and divisions inside his own party widening, Trump is returning to the aggressive trade language that once helped him seize control of the national conversation. The point is not necessarily to impose tariffs, it is to appear dominant, capture headlines, and position foreign partners as adversaries only he can stand up to. The danger, analysts warn, is that this tactic could backfire. The more Trump relies on protectionist theatrics, the more he risks alienating groups that depend on stable supply chains, especially farmers who once backed him enthusiastically. Rising costs and shrinking export markets could turn them against him. In short, the fertilizer threat functions less as policy and more as a high-stakes pressure move, one that may detonate at the worst possible time. Despite the sharp rhetoric, experts on the CTV panel argue that Canada's smartest move is not confrontation, it is strategic patience. The reasoning is simple. Trump is operating from a position of political weakness, and several of his key tariff policies are already under scrutiny at the U.S. Supreme Court. A single ruling against him could unravel existing measures and dramatically reduce his future leverage. If Canada rushes into negotiations now, under pressure and uncertainty, it risks accepting terms that benefit short-term calm but harm long-term national interests. Instead, analysts say Canada should double down on strengthening global trade relationships, expanding potash export markets, and building deeper ties with U.S. states that depend heavily on Canadian fertilizer. These states hold enormous political weight, and their agricultural sectors would be among the earliest victims if tariffs were imposed. Just as important, a measured response keeps Canada from becoming an easy political target. The consensus is unmistakable. Let Washington's internal tensions play out. Trump is already battling on multiple fronts, and Canada does not need to step into the center of that storm. In practice, patience may be Canada's most powerful strategy, calm, deliberate, and rooted in confidence, while the United States confronts the consequences of its own political pressures. To grasp what is at stake, consider the first and most destabilizing scenario. Trump actually follows through. Severe fertilizer tariffs would instantly strain American farmers, drive up production costs, and push food prices higher. The political blowback, especially in agriculture-heavy swing states, could be immediate and fierce. The second scenario is largely symbolic. Trump brandishes the threat, squeezes political leverage out of it, but ultimately backs down before anything real takes effect. He walks away claiming a win, framing himself as tough on trade, while avoiding the economic blowback that actual tariffs would create. Canada suffers no direct harm, but remains stuck navigating an unstable, unpredictable negotiating landscape. The The third scenario depends entirely on the U.S. Supreme Court. If the court strikes down major pieces of Trump's tariff architecture, his negotiating power collapses. Years of trade actions could unravel overnight, and the chance of imposing new tariffs, including on fertilizer, would drop sharply. For Canada, this is the cleanest path to stability without giving up anything in return. Yet behind the headlines lies a deeper story. Trump's threat isn't just about fertilizer. It reflects the political strain pressing down on his administration. Leaders under pressure often reach for familiar tools, tariffs, bold rhetoric, foreign adversaries, to shift attention and reassert control. But here is the paradox. The harder Trump pushes, the more he risks politically. Fertilizer pricing directly affects the cost of food, household budgets, and the economies of entire states, issues voters feel immediately. For Canada, the situation reveals a subtler form of leverage, strength through restraint. Sometimes the real advantage comes from refusing to be dragged into another nation's political storm. Beyond political strategy or economic theory, this fertilizer dispute ultimately hits real people. For farmers in Iowa or Nebraska, even a small rise in input costs can turn razor-thin margins into financial crisis. For families in places like Buffalo or Detroit, higher food prices force painful choices in grocery budgets already strained by inflation. These aren't abstract outcomes. They shape livelihoods, stress levels, and voting behavior every single day. Trump's fertilizer tariff threat is therefore more than a headline. It is a test of economic logic and political judgment. The U.S. relies heavily on Canadian potash, and weaponizing that dependence risks hurting American consumers first. Canada, meanwhile, gains leverage simply by staying patient. So, if you were advising Canada, wait for U.S. pressure to break the threat or confront it head-on.